changed the title a little bit, and this is maybe a bit cryptic, but it does make sense. Unbroken, brokenness, brokenness, broken. Okay, in the interest of time, I usually start with a physics illustration. I'm going to skip the physics illustration. I was going to talk about a thing called broken symmetry, which is a fundamental notion in physics. But basically, broken symmetry is what takes the universe from unstructured chaos towards structure. Broken symmetry is essential for a structured, fruitful universe. And so broken in that sense does not mean kaput, useless, discarded. So I think that's an important idea that has already been touched on, but we need to understand that brokenness in many circumstances can be a fruitful idea. When we turn to biology, we see exactly the same thing, but there's an additional component there, and that's the idea of breaking and repairing. So let's have a look at this. This is, the purple is meant to illustrate the DNA in our bodies. And of course, we all know that the DNA carries the code for making proteins that are essential for structure and metabolic process, life in itself. And there's about 100,000 different proteins that are manufactured in the way that I'm going to describe here. The blue blob is a very complicated molecule called polymerase, and it does the important thing. You know, DNA is a double helix. It does the important thing of breaking open the double helix, reading the code, translating that code into messenger RNA, which then heads out of the nucleus to manufacture the protein. And then importantly, polymerase rebinds the DNA together again. I think this is worth watching. Now, here's the amazing thing. In your body, there's something like 30,000 billion of those little machines which are rattling away at every moment. Fortunately, we can't hear them, otherwise we would be very noisy people. And these things, for example, just picking one protein, hemoglobin, there's 100,000 billion hemoglobin molecules that are made in this way every second in your body, and just in this part, in the bone marrow here. Okay, so I'm going to move on from physics and biology and have a look at the entire Bible. You may not think that's a great plan, but here we go. So I want to traverse, if I can, the entire story of the Bible, for it is all about ongoing brokenness and repair between God and people, between person and person. Genesis starts off, of course, with the creation story. And there's this wonderful description of separation of light from darkness, of day from night, separation of land from the waters. And that idea of separation is very much like the idea of broken symmetry in a metaphorical sense. And then, of course, leaping out of this is broken relationships. Broken relationships between God and Adam and Eve, Cain from Abel, Jacob from Esau, Joseph from his brothers. And there's the broken ecology of Eden, the broken ecology of the fall. Moving on to Exodus, one can think of so many different broken objects and people and things, broken tablets, broken commandments, the broken waters of the Red Sea and the Jordan, and there's the broken walls of Jericho, Ai, Hazor, and many others. If we progress to Deuteronomy, and this is very important in the context of what I want to talk about, there is in Deuteronomy 6, the great Shema, which is the most loved verse in the entire Old Testament for a devout Jew. It is, of course, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Now, the word God that's used there is plural. And the word that is translated as one is really to be translated as a unity. So we have this idea of the eternal unity of the Godhead, which comes out in the Shema, and I'll come back to that. So moving on, the history books, sorry, I haven't been moving on. The history books, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. We have the broken theocracy. You know, Samuel said to the people, "You shall not have a king over you. God shall be your king." And they said, no, we want a king, just like all the other nations around us. So there was the broken theocracy. After Solomon, the broken kingdom, the kingdom of the Hebrews was broken into the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And ongoing throughout the history books is the broken covenant. To the extent that ultimately the people are broken away from their land of promise into exile, first of all, the northern kingdom, and more than 100 years later, the southern kingdom into exile. And there's a fascinating genealogy for Messiah, the son of David, coming through Solomon, coming through Jehoiachin, but then the prophet Jeremiah says, "Consider Jehoiachin childless. No descendant of Jehoiachin shall rule on the throne of David." And that's a puzzle if you believe in messianic prophecy, and it has a wonderful solution, which we won't talk about. But so far, throughout these books of the Bible, the overriding paradigm is a focus on the law of Moses and the ongoing breaking of covenantal law. The remedy, the repair for broken law, is outward religious practice. The Jewish sacrificial system is inextricably tied to the temple and the ritual of animal sacrifice. But when we come to the Psalms, there's an abrupt paradigm shift, a turning from outward religious practice and a turning to the religion of the heart. David says, "As the deer pants for water in a dry and thirsty land, so my soul longs for thee, O Lord." And it's epitomized in David's beautiful psalm of confession that we heard the boys reading earlier. In Psalm 51, after he had been exposed for his affair with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah's subsequent death. In an anguish of guilt, David cries, "You, O God, do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You take no pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." This refocusing on the heart is taken up by the prophets. Jeremiah writes, "Thus says the Lord, I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And Ezekiel writes, "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh." But again, there's a new theme that emerges from the prophets. And this is that God directly suffers for the brokenness and pain of his people. "I am wounded for the wound of my people. I am broken for the brokenness of my people. In all their affliction, he was afflicted." So hitherto, God is untouchable and impenetrable. He resides in sovereign glory. He is the dreadful, impartial judge of all people. He is independent of humankind and needs no human advice or assistance. Job says, "If he withdrew the breath of life, all humanity would perish together and return to the dust." But would God be untouched if he did so? God's true character is to suffer with all suffering. He is so intimately connected to his creation that he is scarred by it. This is more than the vicarious agony of a loving parent over a suffering child. He is conjoined with suffering, blow for blow, wound for wound, break for break. This is the true character of God, and it is the true character of Jesus. Was it not clearly foreshadowed by the prophets? But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was broken for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And this brokenness was supremely voiced, was it not, by that cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In some way that we can only guess at, the eternal unity of the Godhead that we see in the Shema was ruptured. It was broken in that moment. It was just a moment in our time, but because the divine Godhead resides in eternity, beyond our moment-by-moment history, that instant of brokenness exists for all time in God's consciousness. It exists surely in the very nature of God. For Jesus, time does not heal that rift. This is the supreme eternal brokenness of the divine nature. So here are the beginnings of a theology of brokenness. It might or it might not provide some consolation to those who suffer. It doesn't lift the burden. It is a theology of brokenness, not a psychology or a sociology of brokenness, far less a remedy. It is simply a fact that God will not create a wounded world that by its very nature allows the essential element of human free will. God will not create a wounded world and remain exempt from its wounds. God will not allow a broken world and remain exempt from its brokenness. In turning to the New Testament epistles, we find yet a further element. In the reading, we heard these words, He, God, has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature. Participation in the divine nature is not an invitation to comfort or approval or goodness or even loving kindness, but rather it is an invitation to the full extent of the divine nature. including its brokenness. Paul's yearning desire expressed to the Philippians was that I might know him, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. I've long pondered the ambiguous words of the Eucharist. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Do what? Break bread together or be broken for others, heartbroken, worn, even suffering. And the Church of Saints have certainly trodden this weary path. And finally, I come to the last book of the Bible. And in that, we have John's astonishing vision of a new heaven and a new earth. It can be summed up as brokenness unbroken. It is a reversal of Genesis 1 and 2. The separation between heaven and earth is finally broken. God's dwelling place is with people. In Revelation 21, the Genesis separation between light and dark, day and night is broken. The separation between land and sea is explicitly broken. And most vividly, brokenness is illuminated. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. So you see, no more outward religion, purely relational. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. So there we have it. The Bible is a kind of history of human brokenness, isn't it? Brokenness between each other and between us and God. And God's remedy is that awful fracture of the Godhead that occurred on the cross and which must remain eternally present in the broken divine nature. More than 600 years before Christ, the prophet Isaiah foretold that the Messiah would bind up the brokenhearted. That he did, and he taught us to do likewise. That's the social gospel. But a bandage is not sufficient, is it? He did much more. He promises to heal brokenness eternally, and that's the saving gospel. And I want to finish with a reference to a lady who Mary and I honour and respect very deeply. Her late aunt, Marnie Dovey, is featured in this month's Baptist magazine. In the early 1940s, she took the gospel of Jesus to the remote Lushai Hills in India, to a tribe that was formerly headhunters. As a nurse, she offered them the social gospel. As a Christian, she shared the saving gospel of Jesus. And that little jungle village grew to love her deeply, and to this day, to love her Lord in great numbers. It is now a bustling town that was recognized as the tidiest and loveliest town in India. They have sent out numerous doctors, pastors, teachers, and evangelists, and are a beacon of healing up in the hills bordering Myanmar, where they were once kidnappers, killers, and cannibals. This healing came because Marnie was broken for them, broken from family in wartime, broken from country, broken from all the comforts of a good life, broken from the safety nets of police and hospitals. daily facing wild animals, venomous snakes, raging rivers, and tropical disease. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus said, and she did. Amen.